One more prefatory comment before the sermon. I started my ministry in Baltimore, and so I have kept abreast through the Baltimore Sun about the goings-on in Baltimore, even as I have done the same with a newspaper in Jamestown. About 10 days ago, or maybe 2 weeks now, I read the story of a young Baltimore policewoman who was ambushed and killed by a gun in her car while on patrol. She left 4 children. And that was my breaking point. And so this text came to me and this sermon. As some of you know, my mother died this past Monday. Lori and I are deeply grateful for all of your expressions of sympathy and support. I am sad, of course, but that is the natural order of things. Parents are supposed to die before their children. Our gospel story today, though, tells of something unnatural, something vile and violent. After the birth of Jesus, Magi came to Jerusalem asking for directions to the child who had been born with the title King of the Jews, because they wanted to pay him homage. But because absolute power corrupts absolutely, and as we have seen in our country in recent years, even the quest for it does so, King Herod was unnerved by what he perceived to be a threat to his reign. Herod heard about the Magi's inquiry, and so he quickly gathered the area's religious leaders. He then lied to them, a tactic employed by those who wish to cling to power at any cost. Herod asked the scribes and chief priests where he could find the Christ child so that he could go and worship him. We know from our vantage point, of course, that Herod really was trying to gather intelligence so that he could exterminate the peril to his power. When Herod was told that the child had been born in Bethlehem, he commissioned the Magi to go and to search for him, and then to return to tell him exactly where the child could be found. The Magi located the baby Jesus, and they did worship him. But being warned not to go back to Herod, they went home by another route to avoid him. Simultaneously, another messenger from God cautioned Joseph about the plot Herod was hatching against his and Mary's son, and told them to flee into Egypt. When Herod realized he had been tricked, and the Magi were not coming back, he was, as we say today, freaked. He ordered all of the male children under 2 years of age in the vicinity of Bethlehem and Ramah, a village just outside of Bethlehem, to be killed. To be sure the child Herod feared could be a problem was eliminated. Herod's plan was carried out, and the designated children were murdered, a slaughter of innocents. Matthew borrows a passage from the book of Jeremiah to describe the anguish of the mothers, and presumably fathers too, over their dead children. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. Rachel was the mother of Joseph and grandmother to his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. She was thus at least the titular matriarch of the tribes of ancient Israel. And she is pictured in our passage archetypically as weeping and wailing on behalf of all of the mothers of Israel, who saw their children throughout Israel's history carried away into captivity or struck down by invading armies. But mothers still are weeping today as they have watched their immigrant and refugee children being forcibly taken from them at our border and either housed in cages or sent away with little hope of being reunited with their deported parents due to sloppy or non-existent documentation. Mothers still are weeping today for their children who, in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, live in poverty and squalor, and who, because of substandard schools and the orchestrated betrayal of poor families by systems created to serve the interests of higher society, almost certainly are consigned to the kind of life none of us in my hearing today would want for our children. Mothers still are weeping for their children killed and maimed by gun violence perpetrated against them on the streets, in the schools, in the movie theaters, in churches, mosques, and synagogues, in nightclubs, airports, bus stations, stores, and on neighborhood playgrounds. In Harrisburg, in the last decade, over 80 people have been killed by gunfire, the majority of them young black men between the ages of 17 and 25. Gun violence also is a national nightmare. Every day in America, more than 110 people are killed by guns, and an additional 200 plus are shot and wounded. The Washington Post reported in 2018 that there were 393 million civilian-owned guns in the United States, and that number now exceeds 400 million. There are more guns than people in this country. The lack of anywhere near adequate gun and gun control legislation in our country is a gross national sin. Some people will hear that as a political statement, and I've heard church members across the years say that sermons shouldn't be political. I wonder why people say that, since most of what Jesus said had a sharp political edge. Not a partisan edge, but indisputably political. Politics is the arena in which decisions are made that affect people's lives. People's lives are what Jesus cared about. But when I say today that we need a dramatic reorientation in our thinking and practice around handguns and assault weapons in this country, and much better legislation, I mean it mostly as a theological statement. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," has not been lifted or reversed. Jesus did not say, "Blessed is the gun lobby," but "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." St. Paul wrote to the Christians in the Roman Church, and thus also to us, that we are not to avenge ourselves and not to return evil for evil. And Moses brought down a tablet of stone from Mount Sinai on which it was written, "Thou shalt neither make nor worship idols." As a society, we've made idols of guns, haven't we? In guns we trust. If we didn't put our trust in them, why are there so many of them? Why do so many people act as if the Second Amendment is holy writ? Why do national politicians like Representatives Boebert and Massey think it's acceptable to send Christmas cards with their families posing with assault rifles? These are people in positions of high leadership in our country, and they glorify guns and gun violence and individual rights over community consent, and they get elected and re-elected. How is that possible if we as a nation haven't made guns an idol? Mothers still are weeping like Rachel and Ramah. And more than mothers, all who desire a civil society decry violence in any form. Anyone who wants to follow the Christ of God not only advocates for nonviolence, but lives nonviolently. When Jesus was being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and some of his followers sought to defend him by using their swords against his attackers, Jesus immediately told them to put their swords away, because he said, if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. If we live by the gun, chances increasingly are good that we will die by the gun. Worse, even if we do not live by the gun, chances are growing stronger in this gun-addled nation that we will die by the gun, and that just should not be. If someone owns a gun, that is an admission, is it not, that they are willing to use it, or else why have it? Those who say that guns don't kill, people do, apparently fail to see that people may get crazy or angry, but without guns, they cannot so easily kill in the heat of their anger or the fog of their confusion. Undeniably, there are responsible gun owners, but they ought to be, and often are, the first to agree that gun ownership and use must be much more tightly regulated than they are at present. We are not going to reel back in 400 million guns. But how can the church, and by the church I mean its members, not at least be at the forefront of de-escalating the gun culture by refusing to participate in it? How can the church not be in the front echelons of a movement with groups like Heeding God's Call, demanding that our state houses and the Congress of our nation pass rigorous gun control legislation? How can the church not be at the head of the line in pleading for more accessible mental health opportunities that can help people before they act out their anger or trauma by gunning people down or by taking their own lives with guns? A huge problem is that there is a significant part of the larger church that does not believe or follow the biblical gospel of Jesus Christ, even as it creates its own kind of fascism. Let's call it Christian fascism. That is, as you know, a form of far-right, authoritarian ultra-nationalism. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and an ordained Presbyterian minister who recently has written an article that holds wise counsel for churches like Market Square. Hedges writes, "The greatest moral failing of the liberal Christian church is its refusal, justified in the name of tolerance and dialogue, to denounce the followers of the Christian right as heretics. By tolerating the intolerant, it cedes religious legitimacy to an array of con artists, charlatans, demagogues, and their cultish supporters. The liberal Christian church stood by as the core gospel message, concern for the poor and the oppressed, was perverted into a magical world where God and Jesus showered believers with material wealth and power. The white race, especially in the United States, became God's chosen agent. Imperialism and war became divine instruments for purging the world of infidels and barbarians. The iconography and symbols of American nationalism, like guns, became intertwined with the iconography and symbols of the Christian faith. Unfettered greed, a cult of masculinity, lust for violence, white supremacy, bigotry, American chauvinism, religious intolerance, anger, racism, and conspiracy theories defined the central beliefs of the Christian right." So, Market Square beloveds, at the beginning of a new year, we have our work, Christ's work, set before us. We no longer can allow the so-called self-identified Christian right to commandeer the center of the religious stage in our country, as if it speaks for all Christians. We must find our voice in the public square and denounce the blatant misrepresentation of the gospel by the Christian right for its own mostly political ends. And we must, more than ever, answer a reckless and ruinous culture of fear and violence, not on its own terms and strategies, but by making a robust response to the Magi's query, where is the child who was born King of the Jews? Where? Where can the child be found? Wherever justice, mercy, compassion, and humility have gone missing, wherever people suffer, wherever there is hunger and thirst for food and drink or righteousness, wherever dignity and hospitality are in short supply or civil rights have been abrogated, and wherever mothers still are weeping. In those places, we will find Jesus the Christ. And it is there that we will help to till the garden toward the full flowering of Christ's beloved community. May it always be so. Amen.